As a teacher, I have to advise my students on what they should do on and with Twitter and how they should understand it. That's a big stake for me as a university professor. I'm also a student of the changing ecosystem and changing practices of news. I have a lot of questions for our guests, Adam and Nikita, and I distilled my questions into 5 tweets, which I'm going to try to tweet live. I've tweeted presentations live. I've never tweeted an interview live, so I thought like that would be a cool thing to do. So if you follow my account there, Rosen NYU, you'll see like I'm going to tweet the questions right at you. Twitter for news, and you run @gov. Journalists learn that it's news versus government, not news and government. So how do these things combine in your mind? And is Twitter saying through your job, head of news and government, that the problems of news and the problems of government are kind of like the same problems?
I feel like the Donald Trump of social media panels. The two have wound up being very complementary. In part, at a personal level, a function of my own career. Half my career before Twitter was as a journalist, half my career before Twitter was working in politics. So in many ways, it was creating the perfect job for me. But I'm not the only one who wears both hats. It tends to be the model around the world. And I think there's 2 big areas of similarity. One is a bit more conceptual, that goes towards sort of the front part of your question, and one's more practical that goes towards the tail of your question. I think at the philosophic part, it really is the community space of Twitter. It's what our former CEO Dick Costolo used to call the global town square. And when you evoke that image of the town square, you see these institutions of the courthouse, the city hall, the church, the town crier there with the newspaper. And people have come to Twitter to use it as a platform for civic engagement and discussion. And so I think there's a lot of commonality in mission across both news and politics for what we do as a team, which is bringing people into that square to engage, whether that is journalists who use Twitter to gain distribution for quality reporting, journalists who use Twitter to discover news sources and issues, and to take their readers on for the ride, to make news not just something that you read once in the morning and then leave it till the next day, but something that as a reader you can participate in and talk about and be motivated by.
How's that similar
on the politics side?
Yeah,
on the politics side, one of our big areas of focus is to bring elected leaders out to that same square, to step out from behind the lectern, from behind the spokespeople, and directly engage with constituents and allow people that opportunity to ask questions directly of their elected representatives and have that conversation. And so I think the goal across both verticals is largely to bring that civic conversation out into that public forum where people can participate and connect and be part of the process in a meaningful way.
Okay, so
on the practical level,
yeah,
which was the back half of the answer and tied to your question about similar challenges, news organizations, by and large, are not flush with cash right now. Neither is the typical government office. While a lot of big brands, movie franchises, TV shows, and so on have significant budgets behind social media and paid advertising, so on and so forth, news and politics have really needed to rely on that organic side of Twitter, that ability of the quality of the content and the quality of the engagement and the experience driving growth. And so as a result, the best practices for news and politics wind up being very similar. And I think that by bringing more journalists on the platform to engage in that regard and having their sources be out in a public sphere, not behind the same protective walls, of which I used to be one, I think also creates some very interesting dynamics between press and politics as well.
Okay, so are you advising the campaigns on how to go around the journalists and then rushing over to advise the journalists on how to stick it to the campaigns? News and government.
We are advising both groups how to communicate effectively directly with their constituencies and their audience.
Okay. Nikita, I'd love to hear you tell us, why should newsrooms work with Twitter? And particularly, why is it in their self-interest to do so? I assume the reasons why people enter into partnerships are because it's in their self-interest.
So, I mean, news is such an integral part of the platform. Every day people make news, break news, people go to Twitter to react to things. So it just makes sense for newsrooms to work with us to be strategic, because newsrooms obviously have distributed strategies in terms of using Twitter and other social networks as platforms to not only disseminate content, but again, engage with the audiences. And so, you know, Twitter for many years has been part of the sort of like newsroom audience development sort of suite of tools. So, so I think there's just great value in having sort of a newsroom having the finger on the pulse of how people are not only reacting to their content, but engaging with it, engaging with their journalists. And like Adam said, one of my favorite things is when you can go along for the ride with a journalist too, especially if it is a campaign reporter who's, you know, going for the journey with the candidates too. So in my opinion, I feel like it's a very sort of natural relationship. And we, you know, we're very much open to working with all kinds of publishers on all kinds of things too. The editorial calendar, as you know, can mean anything from Fashion Week, which is right on our heels, to State of the Union, to Super Bowl, Oscars. There's all kinds of things, and newsrooms tend to have varying levels of plans for coverage. And so, so for me, I love working with newsrooms because I feel like I have a window into newsrooms, having been in many newsrooms myself.
Mm-hmm. And where do you see the interest diverging?
So I wouldn't really say there is much of that, really, in my opinion. I mean, again, newsrooms do have you know, multi sort of prong strategies in terms of social, which they should, but I don't see the interest kind of diverging, because Twitter is the place where people do, again, like goes back to that town square. They sort of the best content is posted by everybody on the platform. It could be an eyewitness who has just seen something, and that's part of breaking news, a celebrity, an influencer, politician. So I feel like everyone's interests kind of collide.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, it's less a divergence and more sort of a Venn diagram where we have areas where we don't necessarily overlap, but they're not contradictory. At the end of the day, when news partners come in for a conversation with us, what they're looking for is new sources, new audience, and better engagement with both. And if news organizations or anyone are successful on all three of those points using our platform, that's very good for our business. And that's where we're overlapped. But I know we have some of our colleagues from Facebook in here, and I very often sit on panels with some from their political team, and one comment we often make is, when we meet with elected officials, this isn't the dating game where you have to pick one of us to go home with. You should be using every platform that reaches your constituency. And so at the end of the day, there will be parts of that social strategy for our partners that do not involve Twitter. And so you could say that's where we peel off a little bit, but that's not necessarily a contradiction of interests the way I think the question was formulated.
I'm glad you mentioned Facebook, because I want to ask about that. Your counterparts at Facebook visit the same people at news companies, and they grapple with many of the same problems. I've talked to them, so I know. Given recent changes, though, like the fact that Facebook has gotten a lot better at news. They focused on it after having some problems, and like news is showing up much more often now. Facebook and Twitter are going in similar directions with sort of multimedia, the way they're attaching especially a lot of video. Facebook has Instagram, which is live, public, and distributed the way as Twitter always described itself as. So they're becoming more similar, and the difference used to be for you guys when you visited news companies, one big difference used to be, well, Facebook is algorithmic, and we're not. But that might be changing a little bit too. So what are the points of differentiation that you are going to be counting on in the months and years ahead? What are the points of differentiation between you and Facebook in particular that you think will continue to remain true?
Well, I think it's a slight bit of a false premise in that we are not in a zero-sum space there. I use Facebook every day, and I work for Twitter. We do not need to lose a user for Facebook to gain one, nor vice versa. And so I think just the same way as both platforms are part of the strategy for many news publishers, I expect they are both part of the consumption and news diet of the typical news consumer. What I can speak to is our place in news and how it's been historically and how we view things moving forward. You know, Twitter at its core has always been real-time, public, and conversational. And these are the three traits that I think have historically distinguished Twitter among other platforms, not just against Facebook or anyone else, but even in more legacy media environments. The public nature of the conversation, the real-time, live nature of the conversation, and the fact that it is a conversation, that it is a community of interests, and when people gather around an event or around a news story, they can engage in a conversation around that. Now, I sometimes in presentations, and I don't have pretty slides or anything here tonight, but talk about this concept of a color wheel. And we all remember the color wheel from grade school, and you've got the big primary colors, then the secondary colors. And when it comes to the sort of news cycle, the primary colors as we see them are discovery, consumption, and expression. And that, I think, holds true whether you're talking about Twitter. I find a story in my timeline, I click through to the story on some news organization's mobile website, and then I tweet about it to become part of a conversation. That tweet leads other people to discover it, and the cycle goes round and round. But that's not new to us or anyone else. 100 years ago or last week, someone walking up to a newsstand, browsing the front pages, discovering one they wanted to buy, picking it up, reading it, and then arguing about it at the coffee shop. This is a cycle of daily media consumption that is unchanged across cultures and across time. And so our challenge is, how do we continue to take those three differentiating factors, that real-time, public, conversational nature of Twitter, and apply it to build the best experience possible at all three of those nodes and the secondary colors in between. And I think that's where you see us focus with experimenting with new approaches to discovery, new approaches to how we represent conversations, new tools for sharing and tweeting, adding images, adding video. And that's, I think, how we look at it moving forward.
What are the problems Twitter discovered it had to which Project Lightning, in its various parts, is an answer that's coming? So I know you guys want to talk about Project Lightning. I think you should. It's something new that Twitter is going to be developing. I think it's important in the evolution of Twitter, from what I can tell. But I'd like to know, what are the problems Twitter noticed and decided it had to address?
A good problem to have, too much great content.
Too much great content, that's it?
I think that we are now at a point with 500 million tweets or more a day that for some users who self-curate a home timeline, follow many accounts, I follow 800 or so, especially when there's a major event, whether it's a news event, something like the VMAs, where there is sometimes too much for the typical user to really catch all the great stuff flowing through their home timeline. You're also relying on people then to have pre-curated for that event, to go into that award show, that game, that debate, having selected just the right people to follow, to trust, to be saying all the great jokes, bringing you all the best pictures and retweeting all the best tweets. And so the idea of Project Lightning, which we'll be launching later this fall, is how do we give a different lens on Twitter? Not take anything away from that home timeline experience, which is part of that public, real-time, conversational bedrock of the platform. Not filtering anything out from there, but giving an alternate perspective on events. Allowing people to, the night of the VMAs, tune in and see the most engaging, most interesting content that has been curated around that event. And for those who want the best of both worlds, how do we meld that back into that timeline experience so that users have the choice of how they want to experience that event? Do they want to go old school, watch the fire hose of real-time public conversation flowing in, or do they want more of that lean-back experience of seeing the best of? And I think the combination of the two leads to a better experience for all our users.
Nikita, how would you answer that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, one of our biggest issues is discovery. It's so hard to find that awesome content that's there unless you're following somebody or you happen to see a retweet from someone, or with the real-time nature of the platform, it's just very easy to miss things. And so sometimes you might even discover great tweets if they're embedded in a story, right, versus actually on the platform. And so given that 80% of our audience is on mobile, I, for one, am thrilled about Project Lightning. I think it's going to be awesome. I think it's going to be a really great way to showcase all the best content. And again, and that will be content objectively from the entire Twitter community. So it's eyewitnesses, folks in newsrooms, key public figures as well. And the cool thing is that this will be the first time Twitter is experimenting with human curation. So Andrew Fitzgerald, who was on the partnerships team, has shifted over to kind of lead editorial efforts, and he's building out a team of curators. So, so that, again, is something very different for us, something very fun, and the nature of Project Lightning will be covering everything: breaking news, sports, TV, meme of the day. So I really do think that users, existing users and new users to the platform, will find it to be a great resource. I call Project Lightning a sort of destination for discovery.
Okay, I'm glad you brought up the curation team. That's my next question. The tweet reads is this: Twitter hiring journalists to curate best of tabs is the birth of a new editorial beast. So how do we know this beast has a soul? To me,
right now, I wish we had more than 140 characters.
Well, we do. We add 15 minutes, actually, yeah.
DM the question. There you go.
So here's my question. So to me, Twitter's always baked into itself lots of judgments, lots of decisions have to be made about what's going to be priority. So it's always been saturated with judgment. But it hasn't been, up to now, an editorial company in the way I understand an editorial company, which is trying to create new content that informs people. It's instead trying to be a platform or a system for doing that. But when you get to the point where you're hiring journalists to curate best of feeds around key public events, those people are doing something that is through and through editorial work. So my question is, where does the editorial culture and spirit and animation come from in a company that hasn't been an editorial company up to now? Now, the easy answer to that question, which I know you're going to give me, is, well, we're going to hire professional journalists to do this. We're going to hire people who know how to do this. They're experienced pros, and I get that. And I know Andrew, and I know how good he is. But you still have to instruct those people. Those people are going to be smart enough to understand where Twitter's bread and butter lies. There's still huge conflicts between good curation, perhaps, and the business interests of Twitter. So my question is, how do you instruct people in an editorial culture that hasn't existed before, and what is going to be the soul of the editorial Twitter? You can see I'm animated by this subject, so I'm banging things and running into stuff. But anyway, that's my question. That's what I meant by soul.
Well, I think hiring journalists is certainly a part of it, but it wasn't going to be my lead. I think the lead is that we are already a company of passionate news consumers. You see on the internal email threads around the company about different product features, about different experiences like Project Lightning, around different events. The emails we get from Jack Dorsey, our founder and interim CEO, about major news stories and so on. Every colleague 201 loves news. It's one of the things that makes them passionate about Twitter, because it is such a direct access to great news content and discovery mechanism of great news content. And so I think everyone, just as a user of Twitter, is already invested in that experience being a quality one.
Okay, so people at Twitter love news. That's part of the answer.
Then part of the answer, adding a layer, is of course hiring journalists to do it.
We're going to hire professionals. That's another part.
A third part of the answer is, one way in any context to evaluate the quality of someone's journalism. If you're an editor and charges have been levied against one of your reporters on the quality of their journalism, you'd take their notes. You'd look at the raw tape of the interview. You'd go back to some of the primary sources and see all the material they worked with, so that you could evaluate whether they did the most appropriate curation of those facts into a reported narrative. To go back to how we described Project Lightning at the beginning, the home timeline isn't going anywhere. The search tools that let you find every single tweet isn't going anywhere. There's no original reporting being created by this team. It is just gathering those tweets. So every single step this team is taking is something that is fully open for other people to see what was curated, what was not curated, and evaluate the quality of the product as a result. Mm-hmm. And then the last layer I would add is we've provided curation tools to many of our partners. Over, I think, nearly 2 years ago now, we launched Twitter collections, or custom timelines, the ability to manually curate tweets into collected groups around a particular topic or event. That was built into TweetDeck. We recently launched a product called Curator that enables newsrooms to do it using a different tool. And so we're going to continue investing in the ability for our partners and for regular users to curate content as well and blend that into the experience, so that our editorial voice, such as it is, isn't the only voice on the platform.
Okay. I didn't really get an answer to my question, so I'm going to ask it again. Here's what I mean. When these people go to work, there's going to be like a launch day where they're covering some event, right? And Andrew and his team of curators are scanning, presumably using algorithmic tools to help them. We didn't mention that, but I assume that's part of it, right? Using tools to help them, and they're going to be picking what deserves to be in a best of tweet, right? Stream. So the act of choosing is inherently an editorial act. And what I'm asking is, how are you going to instruct them to do that? Like, what are we looking for when we're picking? How do we think about the potential conflicts between, for example, big customers for Twitter and happening to pick their tweets as best ofs, right? How do you govern like simple conflicts like that? An editorial company has a structure already built in place for that. Twitter does not necessarily. So what are they supposed to be? What's like the program or editing selection criteria, the decision rule that they're supposed to be employing when they do this curation?
Sure. So I don't want to speak for Andrew, but I can say that he and the team are coming up with a set of editorial guidelines, and they do want to be objective. So they're going to, not keep advertisers in mind, and